Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg. I'm here today to do a Friday Reads where I wrap up the week in reading and talk about any exciting bookish news that has happened this week. This is my last day of working from the couch with my buddy Teddy. Joel is actually on his way home from the work trip that he has been on. And Teddy tends to get separation anxiety. It's been a little bit rough for him this week. So I have been making sure instead of working at my desk, I have been here. There has not been a whole lot of new events going on in the bookish world, so we're going to keep that section really quick, and then we're going to jump very fast to the Friday Reads portion of the video where I'll be talking about the books that I read. I finished 3 books this week, so I feel pretty good about that. The only thing to really note before we do jump into the Friday Reads is that although nothing really happened this week because we got the long list for the National Book Award for Fiction last week, we will be getting the shortlist for the Booker Prize. And that will be coming on Tuesday. I believe it will be coming around lunchtime for me. I am hoping that I will be able to film a video very quickly and turn it around and give you my reaction. It's an interesting perspective for this year because I don't usually end up reading as much of the long list as I have this year. And I've read 4 of the books, and hopefully by the time I get the short list, I will have begun a 5th. Because all of my reviews will be linked down below for the videos, the books that I have read so far. But I'm hoping that I will be starting the audio of The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny this weekend. So fingers crossed for that. Let's start talking about the books that I read this week. I actually don't have physical copies of any of the books that I have read. That's because they were, 2 of them were library books and I returned them, and the 3rd was an audiobook. So let's start talking about them. The first one that I finished this week was Hunchback by Sao Ichikawa. This is a translated work of literature. It was translated by Polly Barton. It had been on the long list for the International Booker Prize earlier this year, and it ended up on the long list for the National Book Awards Prize for Translated Literature. So I got a copy from the library. I happened to walk in the day after the long list for that Translated Literature Prize was announced, and I saw Hunchback on the new releases display that they have next to where the holds are. And I thought, you know what, let me just try this book, especially after I opened it and realized it's very short. So it certainly fits for shorty September. So I got it. And I took a little bit of a break from Flesh by David Zaloy, which will be the next book that we talk about, the next book that I finished. But I just needed a little bit of a break and to get through something a little quickly. So Hunchback really ended up fitting the bill for that. So it is about a woman with a congenital muscle disorder who lives in Japan. She is living in a care home, and she sometimes will think about the things that she doesn't get to participate in that other people do. She has started a Twitter account, for example, and sometimes she will post things on that account that are a little bit, the way she thinks of it is sort of trolling the world, except nobody's really paying attention to her Twitter account, but where she will say sort of challenging or in-your-face things that she would like to experience. Like she would like to experience what it is to be a prostitute for a day. And the sort of critical one that she posts is that she would like to experience becoming pregnant and then having an abortion, which is something that she has not been able to do before. And the abortion part of it begins with the understanding of, like, she would like to feel what it's like to become pregnant, but she knows that she would not be able to carry a pregnancy to term. So basically, it starts as thinking like that, but then because there's an in-your-face element, she knows it would be controversial, she throws it in there anyway. You can imagine from this that this is a book that will definitely be cilantro, and it has been cilantro when it was on the International Booker long list, and probably will be again now that it is on the National Book Award long list for translated literature. I have gotten comments from people who say they didn't finish it. They absolutely hate it. It's one of the worst books they've ever read. It's not actually a bad book. I think for the most part, if you object to Hunchback, it will be the content that is rubbing you the wrong way. That's my guess. I could be wrong about that. Because the writing is perfectly fine. It's some of the ideas, and I think there's something very interesting in that Sao Ichikawa is doing. She's sort of pushing against the notion, like stereotypes of people who live with disability. And one of those is the idea that people living with a disability should be saintly figures. And our protagonist here is absolutely not a saintly figure at all, although she is generous with the money that she has inherited from her parents. But she's a complicated person, like we all are. And I find that book very interesting in this book. Although I will say I didn't love the book, I find it incredibly interesting. A lot of people, as I said, are going to have a very aggressive reaction to the book. And I think that a lot of that is going to have to do with the content of it. It did make me think of another book that approaches the topic of disability. And one thing I want to mention before I have a chance to forget is that Sao Ichikawa does live with a congenital muscular disorder. And therefore, she has firsthand experience with what our protagonist is going through and the sort of stereotypes that she would be bumping up against and the things that she might mourn not being able to experience for herself. And that is another thing that I find very interesting about the book. But it did remind me of a different book that centers someone living with a disability, another book that can be very difficult to read, and that book is Elena Knows by Claudia Pinheiro. This book is about a woman who is, I'm forgetting exactly what she is living with, and it doesn't say, but it's one of the, I want to say it's like multiple sclerosis, but it's a condition where her body's deteriorating over time. She's losing control of her body, losing control of her muscles, losing her ability to move around independently on her own. And the tension in the book is coming from the idea that she is trying to investigate the death of her daughter. Her daughter has died. It has been ruled a suicide. She doesn't believe that it was a suicide. So she's trying to gather information, but she has to time her outing with her medication schedule. And there's a desperation that is really enhanced by the fact that her body is failing her as she is trying to go out and gather information. And also the fact that her investigation is prompted very specifically by her own grief over her daughter's death. I will say, I think Elena Knows is a better book, perhaps a more interesting book, but it's in the same wheelhouse for sure. So I think what the best thing to do would be to advise you that there are things about the content of Hunchback that will put people off. If Elena Knows sounds like a better way to approach a topic like that, go with this one. If the idea of all of the prickly and thorny things going on, it just doesn't sound like something you would really like to engage with, go for it. Ideally, I think you'd be able to read both because it is a very different perspective, and especially the perspective from Sao Ichikawa as someone who does live with the condition of the character that she's writing about. I think there's merit to that. I think it is important. But if you're looking for a better book, I do think it is Elena Knows. Although Sao Ichikawa is a good writer. I don't want to denigrate that. It's just that this is not a book that's going to be for everyone. It is a cilantro book through and through, and sometimes people get confused when I say cilantro book. It just means people will love it or they hate it, just like cilantro. Some people will have a visceral anti reaction to it, and I think that is definitely the case with Hunchback, and I think that's why I've gotten some pretty aggressive comments about how much people have disliked this book. And, you know, I didn't have that reaction. And although I didn't love the book, I found it really interesting and worth reading. So that's my experience with Hunchback by Sao Ichikawa and translated by Polly Barton. The next book that I finished will be very easy to talk about because it's Flesh by David Zaloy. This is something that I read as part of my unexpected journey through a couple of the books that were longlisted for the Booker Prize this year. That's not something I usually do, but I ended up, as I said, reading 4 of the books, and I will say I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about Flesh here. I did a individual review of it that will be linked in the description box down below, so you can navigate to that if you want my full feelings about it. But I definitely get the impression that the jury for the Booker Prize this year is, they are big fans of books that exist on vibes, and books that aren't very plot heavy, that aren't very aggressive in trying to get a point across. They like books that are very introspective and maybe meandering. And I haven't had a particularly good time reading the books that I have read for this long list, and Flesh continued that, although it might be the best of the bunch so far. Although I do want to read The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny, and I do have a hold on Love Forms by Claire Adam. I have heard good things about that one. So whenever my library hold becomes available, I will probably try to fit it in and read that one. That takes us to the third book that I finished this past week, and that is The Museum of Ordinary People by Mike Gale. I had not heard of Mike Gale until earlier this year when I read the book The Stand-In Dad by Alex Summers. And the description for that book compared it to Matt Cain. I almost forgot the name. Matt Cain, whom I love. I have really enjoyed Matt Cain's books. And Ryan Love, who has only published 1 book, but I did enjoy that book. I do think there are ways in which you can tell it's a first novel, but I think there are certainly indications that Ryan Love will be in the same camp as Matt Cain, with a couple more books under his belt. And then the third one was Mike Gale, who I had never heard of, so I looked him up, and his books sounded great. Joel actually managed to read one first. He read The Museum of Ordinary People about a month, maybe 2 months ago, but I think it was only a month ago. And he liked it enough that I got on the hold list for it, and it became available. So I decided to listen to this one before jumping into The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. Maybe that was a mistake. If I was thinking strictly in terms of getting things finished before the announcement of the shortlist for the Booker Prize, I wouldn't have done it that way. But, you know, the hold was available. I'm not thinking about it that way, so I just decided to do it. This is a book about Jess Baxter, who is a Black woman in the UK. Her mother has recently died, and she is still dealing with a lot of the remaining items that her mother has sort of left behind. And of course, she's also dealing with her grief over it. And she has a set of encyclopedias that her mother had given to her, and which she loved because it was a sign of her mother, who didn't have a whole lot of income, spending money on something to support her education, because she knew that her daughter was smart and capable of things and wanting to be able to support that. So the encyclopedias are a sort of stand-in for things about her mother that she cannot let go. And although she has dealt with the other belongings in the house, she has a very tight amount of space in the apartment that she is sharing with her boyfriend. And it is now coming to a point where they need the space. They're thinking of moving, so they need to show the apartment that they are in. And when they move, the boyfriend is sort of casually suggesting that he doesn't really want the encyclopedias to be around when they move. So she doesn't want to just throw them out. She wants to make sure they go somewhere where they will be appreciated. Eventually, she gets pointed in the direction of the Museum of Ordinary People, which at that point isn't really a museum, it's sort of a collection. There was a man whose last name was Barkley, who owned a business that would haul things away for people. And over time, they would find things that clearly were meaningful or people would tell them had been meaningful. And Barkley decided to accumulate these things so they would have a place. And they started calling it the Museum of Ordinary People, although it was not, strictly speaking, a museum. And their words kind of got out. There was an article about the museum, and people would come to visit, but it's a very informal thing. So Jess goes, she finds out about it. There's a new owner because Barkley has died, and he left the business and everything he owned to a man named Alex, who had never known Barkley before and doesn't understand why he left everything to him. So Jess learns about the museum. She goes there intending to find a home for her encyclopedias and ends up getting really invested in the story. She had wanted to be a museum curator in a previous life, but her mother's illness forced her to take a break from school that turned into a permanent thing. So she sees this as a way of getting back on track. She convinces Alex, the new owner, to let her try to make a go at making it an actual museum. And it's a way of honoring people's stories, like ordinary people. These are not things that you would find in a museum. You know, they could even look like junk to other people. But because they have these attachments to the items, they mean something. And they reflect the lives of people who have stories that are usually not told commonly. And there is something very beautiful in telling that story. This is a very cinnamon bun book. It is a very enjoyable story. Jess has a friend named Luce, and their friendship is really great. I enjoyed reading about that. It's a book about seeing other people and their stories and honoring that. And that's something that I really honestly appreciate. So it felt good to see in print. Well, I listened to the audio. The audio is really, really great. I can't remember the name of the person who narrates the audiobook, but she does a very good job. And it was just fun to sometimes to sit and listen to her talk, which is a good thing when you're listening to an audiobook, for sure. So I ultimately enjoyed this book. I would absolutely read more books by Mike Gale. I have another one in my library, and I'm going to grab my laptop and see if I can quickly pull it up, because I don't remember what the name of the book that I have is, but I'm willing to bet that I can pull it up quickly on Bookshop. It's All the Lonely People. That was the one that I had fully expected would be the first book by Mike Gale that I would try. But although I did find a copy of the physical book, the fact that Joel listened to the Museum of Ordinary People and loved it so much made me go in that direction instead. But All the Lonely People sounds really great. Absolute Matt Cain vibes, and I can't wait to get around to reading that one as well. So all in all, not a bad reading week. 3 books, and although the Museum of Ordinary People is the only one I would say I liked, there was certainly, well, no, I did like Hunchback because I found it interesting. That's not fair. But I would say I liked the Museum of Ordinary People the most. I found Hunchback fascinating, and it's such a short book that it's not difficult to read. I have complicated feelings about Flesh, but all in all, I would say it's a very good and successful reading week. I'm also pretty far along in another book, and I have just started a short audiobook. And that's another thing that's kind of in the way of me starting The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. Hopefully, after I film this video, I'll be able to make some good progress on that, because I tend not to listen to audiobooks over the weekend. So we'll see how that goes. And we'll talk about that one in a second. The book that I picked up after I finished Flesh, because I felt like I needed a bit of a palate cleanse, something I could read quickly before diving into another book, and a bit of a long book. I wanted to read Buckeye by Patrick Ryan next, so that's the plan. But I felt like I wanted something to clear out my system. And I looked at my pile of possibilities for the month of September, all of the shorties that I was considering getting to whenever I had a moment. And I picked out a couple and read the first pages, and I did not think this was the way the wind was going to blow. But here we are. Mrs. Miniver by Jan Struther. Now, if you follow along, you know that in addition to being obsessed with books, I am obsessed with movies, specifically the Academy Awards. I love like old movies and film history and all of that stuff. So, Mrs. Miniver is the film that won the Oscar for Best Picture for the year 1942. It is a very interesting film on its own because it was seen as a way of encouraging the American population to feel better about entering World War II. Because, I don't want to get into a history lesson, but prior to World War II, and even after World War I, America had had a policy of isolationism and not getting involved in problems in Europe. And although World War I had already happened, there were a lot of people who did not want to get involved in World War II. And then Pearl Harbor, but I can't remember if it was Eleanor Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt credited Mrs. Miniver with helping America get into the war. And so the book and the film, because the book was published in the United States around the same time, the book and the film are a really interesting time capsule for that. And it's even more interesting when you get to know what it was, its place in the UK at the time that it was published. Mrs. Miniver was originally serialized in a newspaper. They were looking for someone to write stories about a sort of every woman. And there is a case to be made, and it would be an interesting case, about what they defined as an every woman, because Mrs. Miniver is not in the elite class of society, but she is a privileged and wealthy white woman. You know, the Minivers have a home in London and they have a country home. They go on a lot of trips. She goes shopping, and although money comes up and they are careful about the expenses that they accrue, money isn't really a constraint. And you could certainly make a case that most people living in the UK at the time would not have those privileges or those freedoms, especially because when the war comes, a lot of people sent their children out of London. And for most people, it was a difficult thing to do. Or if you didn't want to be in a city that was being bombed or where that danger was very real, you'd have to find a place to go. And you didn't have a country home of your own to escape to. So there are definitely interesting interactions with that. And like I said, I think it's very fascinating how they defined every woman, because it's not, their definition of every woman is not the experience of the majority of people, I would say. Not, having like a graduate degree in British history or anything like that. But these were sort of intended to be folksy, feel-good stories. And the real genius of Jan Struther is that, yes, there are ways in which Mrs. Miniver is designed to be relatable to a lot of different people and that have that sort of every woman quality. But she was smart enough to realize that there also needed to be something that set Mrs. Miniver apart. For instance, she used the name Miniver, which I believe is like a fur trim, because it was not a common name. She didn't want to give her character a name that would be found or that people would say, oh, I know a Smith. It's like this book is about them. She wanted Mrs. Miniver to be a sort of singular figure. And what's interesting as well is that a lot of these are, because it was serialized, the chapters are incredibly short and they function as sort of vignettes. Quick little things where, in the first one, Mrs. Miniver comes home. So you have 1, 2, 3. Oh, I'm skipping too many pages. And then barely 4 pages of Mrs. Miniver returning to her home, which sort of sets the scene for where she lives, who she lives with, and her overall attitude about life. Then the new car. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 pages about the family getting a new car. And that sort of introduces the fact that this is an expense for them. They are capable of doing that financially, but you also get to know Mrs. Miniver more because she's attached to things. And then Guy Fawkes Day. And it sort of continues in that vein, the eve of the shoot. So that's before they go to a hunting party and Christmas shopping, things that people can relate to. Not so much the hunting, and if you live in the United States, not Guy Fawkes Day either, but it's relatable things that people can do. But buried within there are references to the war and the hardships of living through it. Now, it's not that the Minivers are living through austerity. At least at the point of the book where I am, which is like more than halfway, just a little more, they haven't had to deal with like rationing or anything like that. However, the story that I just read is called Gas Masks, and it's about Mrs. Miniver taking her children and the maid and another woman to get fitted for gas masks because they live in a country where they have every reason to expect that they might need those at some point. So mixed in with these charming stories about life in the UK at the time, there are stories about war and the hardships of that, which people were going through at the time these stories were published. And there is a sense of, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but it is interesting as well, because if you were someone at the time who maybe had a resistance to getting fitted for a gas mask or something like that, there were these stories in the newspaper sort of normalizing that, encouraging you to think about doing it, because the story very much acknowledges that this is an uncomfortable thing to do. Mrs. Miniver's youngest son is afraid of seeing his mother in the mask, and she has to sort of talk him down from that. But so you get the sense that, well, Mrs. Miniver, someone I love, is going through this with me. And I can do it knowing that she has done it as well, even though it's a fictional character, but, you know, because it reflects your life so closely. So basically, this book is absolutely fascinating, and it is very charming and sweet. You do have to think about a little bit how this was portrayed as a sort of every woman thing, when, as I said, there are absolutely questions of privilege and status and class consciousness that are simmering under the surface, not really being acknowledged. But it's also fascinating because you have elements that maybe encourage you to participate in the war effort, but you also have a sense that these charming stories of Mrs. Miniver's everyday life are sort of setting the stakes for the war as well. There's a way of saying without saying that this is the life we want to return to when the war is over. This is what we're fighting for. This is what we are trying to save. And again, you can get into very interesting conversations about how they've chosen this vision of what is worth saving and what they want to get back to. But still, I'm just having such a good time reading this book because it's short. It is 161 pages. It reads very quickly. First of all, because every story is about 3 to 4 pages, but also because it is so charming. A lot of the time when something has a very charming tone, it carries you through the reading of it effortlessly. And that is absolutely the case with this. I read most of what I have read yesterday alone. So that says a lot. Hopefully I'll be able to make a lot of progress tonight. And I'm filming this on Friday, so tomorrow will be Saturday morning. Hopefully I'll be able to, if I haven't finished it yet, I'll be able to finish it off tomorrow morning and be ready to jump into Buckeye by Patrick Ryan. But very fascinating read, not something I'm willing to bet a lot of people have on their reading list. But if you can find a copy, I happened to see this at a used bookstore in Montana, and it was in a creepy basement of that used bookstore. I almost didn't fully browse through. I'm so glad I did, because I found this copy of the book, and because of my interest in the Academy Awards, it really jumped out to me. And when I read the back and a little bit of the foreword from Armistead Maupin, who wrote Tales of the City, I was really sold on the idea of reading it for myself, and I'm so glad that I am doing that. So the book that I forgot to grab a copy of, I do have the physical copy of the book that I'm listening to on audio now. It's Balzac and the Little Chinese Seamstress by Dai CJ, and it is narrated by B.D. Wong. I started the audio of it. I'm not very far into it at all. I only started it this morning, but this is a story about a 17-year-old and an 18-year-old who have been sent to a village to be re-educated during the Cultural Revolution in China. And so far, it is very interesting. But as I said, I'm really not far enough in to say either way. But it seems very good. And it's only about a 4-hour audiobook. So hopefully I'll be done with it quickly. And then I will be getting into The Loneliness of Sonia and Sunny. That is everything that I have been reading and watching and enjoying this week. Stay tuned for the Booker Prize shortlist reaction. And we're not far from the Nobel Prize announcement, which will be somewhere around October 9th, and the National Book Award finalists, which will be coming on October 7th. So lots going on and lots to come. So stay tuned for all of that. As always, I really appreciate your time. Teddy and I would like to say happy reading.